You step in to cover a shift because the business needs it that day, which is fair enough. Then the next week, the same gap appears and you step in again. And then the week after that, and within a month, without anyone actually deciding it, that shift has become part of your job. Nobody chooses that. It just happens. And now the thing you stepped into is a thing that you can't seem to step back out of. That pattern, in some version or another, is running quietly inside almost every independent hospitality business in the country. And the founders inside those businesses are being consumed by it without noticing. Because from the outside, and often from the inside, absorbing every gap looks exactly like leadership. This video is about the difference between the two. Welcome to the Lead Well channel, where we explore the inner world of leadership, well-being, and what it means to build a business and a life that doesn't break you. My name's Trevor, and I've run a multi-award winning restaurant and cocktail bar, but I didn't come from a hospitality background. I built the business from the ground on up, learning as I went, figuring it out in real time. This isn't a video about doing less. Hospitality doesn't work like that. Anyone who tells you it does hasn't run a venue. This is a video about the difference between choosing to step in and being absorbed by stepping in, between covering a gap and becoming the gap, and why the founders who can do everything are usually the ones who choose to do very little of it. If you built your business from the ground up, you can probably do every job that's in it. I want to make at the center of this video. Absorbing every gap is not leadership. It feels like leadership because it looks like commitment. It looks like the founder rolling up their sleeves and doing whatever it takes. And the industry celebrates that as a virtue. The founder who never says no, who covers the shifts, who fills the gaps, who does the work that needs doing regardless of whose job it technically is. The industry loves that founder because that founder is easy to hold up as an example. But over time, absorbing everything is what breaks founders. It's what turns owners into operators and then operators into husks of themselves. Because the person absorbing is not doing the work only that they can do. They're doing the work anyone can do, while the work only they can do quietly goes undone. And the business in slow motion starts to reflect that. The strategy that never gets refined, the team culture that never gets developed, the systems that never get built on, all of it invisible in the short term, all of it corrosive in the long term. The difference between the founder who covers a shift and the founder who becomes a shift worker is not the covering. It's whether they can put the covering down when it's no longer needed, whether they can move back to the work that only they can do without leaving a mess behind them or without carrying the operational identity with them like a second skin. The founder who can step in and step back out, that's the version worth being, not the founder who does everything. The founder who could do everything and chooses deliberately and specifically to do very little of it. Here's the reframe that I think matters most for this video. Most founders assume structure and flexibility are opposites, that having a defined shape for their week, clear rhythms, non-negotiables that don't move, means that they're too rigid to respond when the business genuinely needs them. So they resist structure, they keep everything flexible, they pride themselves on being able to move in any direction at any given moment. And what happens is that they get pulled around by whatever's loudest. They think they're being adaptable. They're actually being reactive, because if there's no shape to move from, there's no shape to return to. Every movement becomes permanent by default. There's nothing pulling you back into the center because there isn't any center. The truth is the opposite of what most founders assume. Structure is what makes real flexibility possible. If you have a stable center, if you have a clear picture of what your week normally looks like and what you're normally pointed at, then when the business needs you to step into something different, you can. You know where you're stepping in from. You know when you need to step back into it. You have a reference point that tells you whether you're briefly filling a gap or slowly being consumed by one. This is what having a framework in place actually gives you. Not rigidity, not a rule book that limits your ability to respond, a stable version of yourself that you can move from and return to. That return is what separates the balanced founder from the absorbed one. I know this because I've lived both versions of it. Once I had the framework in place, I could fill in for shifts when the business needed me. I could cover for a manager who was on holiday. I could step into whatever role was open for a defined period, do the work, and step back out again cleanly when that period was over. The center held, so the temporary stayed temporary. At my worst, without that structure, every step became permanent. The covering became who I was because there was nothing to step back into and no reason to make that step back happen. The absence of structure didn't make me flexible, it just meant I had no way of ever giving anything back. Before I go any further, I want to mention my Lead Well sprint. If you're a hospitality founder who's carrying more than most people around you realize, and you know that something has to change, this is my entry point to working with me properly. It's 4 weeks, 1 hour a week, focused work with founders who are ready to start rebuilding the foundation underneath everything that they've built. It starts with a free call so we can talk through what you're carrying and whether the sprint is right for you. If any of this is landing on you, head to the website, the link's in the description. I'd love to talk to you. Let's get back to the video. Let me try and describe what a balanced founder actually looks like in practice, because I don't want this to stay in the abstract. At the center is you, the person, the set of values and priorities and non-negotiables that don't change regardless of what the business is doing that week. That's the foundation. That's what the business is built on. That's what the team is being led from, and it just doesn't move. Around that center are the roles. Some of them are yours by default, the strategy, the direction, the decisions only you can make, the relationships that you need specifically, the work that keeps the whole thing pointed at where it's supposed to be going. That's where you sit most of the time when things are working as they should. Other roles are things that you might step into for a defined period, covering the bar for a week while you recruit a bartender, handling a difficult customer situation because you're genuinely the right person for that day, running the ordering while your GM's on holiday, stepping into a kitchen for a lunch shift because your chef's off sick. These are movements out of the center. They're not you leaving the center, they're you extending temporarily into a role that needs you for a specific reason and for a specific length of time. The critical thing, the thing that separates the balanced founder from the absorbed one, is the return. Every time you step into a role that isn't yours by default, you need to know how you're getting back to the center. You need to plan for when the covering ends. You need someone or something ready to take it back when the temporary period is over. Otherwise, and this is the part almost every hospitality founder gets wrong, it isn't temporary. It becomes the new normal in disguise. The founder who can move without losing themselves has a strong foundation and a clear return. The founder who absorbs and never gives back has neither. Both of them are working hard. Both of them care about the business. Both of them look from the outside like committed hospitality owners. The difference is invisible to anyone watching, but over time, the difference is everything. Here's the practical judgment that separates the two versions. It isn't a rule book. It's a set of questions worth asking yourself before you step into any role that isn't yours by default. Step in when it genuinely serves the business and the return is planned. When there's a specific reason your presence in that role adds value that couldn't be added by anyone else in that moment. When you know how long you'll be there and what the end of it actually looks like. When stepping in doesn't cost you the work only you can do for longer than you can afford to lose it. Step back when the immediate need has passed, when the person who should be doing the role is available again, when continuing to be there would start to displace the founder work indefinitely, when the covering has started to feel like normal rather than a response to a specific gap that needed filling for a specific reason. The hardest version of this is when the business is under pressure and the temptation is just to keep absorbing. You tell yourself you'll step back when things settle down. Things rarely settle on their own. And every week you don't step back makes stepping back even harder. The muscle atrophies. The center gets blurry. The role you are covering becomes who you are. And by the time you notice, the return is genuinely difficult because the structure that would have supported it has been eroded by your own absence from it. The balanced founder makes a return part of the decision to step in. That's the practical shift. Not asking whether to step in, asking how you're going to step out again before you take the first step in. If you can't see how that return happens, don't take the step. Find another way. Have a difficult conversation with the team about what needs to happen instead, because permanent absorption of a role that isn't yours is not a leadership decision. It's a leadership failure disguised as commitment. I want to be clear here because I don't want this to sound theoretical. Every hospitality founder is going to end up doing things that aren't strictly in their job description at some point. That's the reality of running an independent venue right now. What I'm talking about isn't a fantasy where you never cover a shift or handle an operational task. I'm talking about the difference between doing those things as deliberate responses to specific situations and doing those things in a default way of being in the business. Those two versions look identical for a day or a week. Over months and years, they produce two completely different founders. I want to close with what this actually gives you when it's working properly, because I think the argument for structure and center and deliberate movement can sound like extra work, like one more thing to manage on top of everything else. And it's worth naming what it gives back. A team that grows, because when you're not absorbing every gap, the people around you learn to fill them. They step up. They develop the judgment and the skills they need to become the version of themselves the business actually needs them to be. When you absorb everything, you rob them of that development. Not intentionally, but absolutely. The team that reports to a founder who does everything becomes a team that can't do very much on their own. A business that scales, not necessarily in size, in sustainability, in its ability to keep running when you're not physically present, in its capacity to weather difficult periods without collapsing because the founder is the only thing holding it together. The founder that has built a center and knows how to move from it has built a business that has a shape independent of any single person, even a person as central as they are. A life outside the venue, because the center isn't just professional, it's personal too. The non-negotiables that keep you grounded, the rhythms that keep you human, the relationships and the interests and the part of yourself that exists outside of what you've built. All of that becomes possible when you're not being pulled apart by every gap that needs filling. When you've built a version of yourself and a version of the business that lets you lead from the center rather than getting shredded around the edges. And ultimately, a founder who is still standing in 10 years. That might be the most important thing, because the founders who absorb everything don't usually make it that long. Not because the business fails, because they do. They burn out, they collapse. They walk away from something they built because they couldn't build it in a way that didn't consume them. The founder who can do everything but chose to do very little of it are the ones who are still there for the third act, still leading, still building, still themselves. It's the one who could do everything but chooses to do very little of it because they've built the version of themselves and the version of the business that lets them lead from the center rather than getting pulled around the edges. Build the center, protect the return, choose deliberately where you move, and watch what happens to the business and to you over the next 12 months when the structure holds. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to give it a like and a subscribe. It helps me, it helps the channel, and it helps people like us find the content that really matters. And as always, I'd love to remind you that you matter too. Don't forget that.